Greetings, cinephiles. I'm Sue Wright, and with me today I have our Aussie Pops.
Great to be here, Sue.
And welcome to the Wild Rivers Film Radio, the official podcast of the Wild Rivers Film Festival on KCIW 100.7 FM. Today we're sitting down with musician, songwriter, playwright, Rabbi Robbie Schaefer to discuss the film Burst the Silence, a musical memoir about father and son relationships. But before we get started, we'd like to thank Wild Rivers Film Festival's 2025 presenting sponsor, the Tolowa Dene Nation. Thank you for making the film festival and our summer film workshop possible this year.
Yes, thank you, Tolowa.
This year's Wild Rivers Film Festival is also brought to you in part by the Roundhouse Foundation, Travel Curry Coast, Sutter Coast Hospital, and the City of Brookings. If you're interested in being a sponsor for the Wild Rivers Film Festival and our mission to celebrate indie cinema, support film education, and build a film economy on the Wild Rivers Coast, you can learn more on our website, wildriversfilmfestival.com. If this is the first time you're hearing about the Wild Rivers Film Festival, we're so glad you're joining us. The Wild Rivers Film Festival is a celebration of indie and local cinema that happens during the third week of August in Brookings. Over the course of 4 days, we screen more than 24 films at 3 locations across the city. Many of our film screenings feature Q&A sessions from visiting filmmakers, and our festival includes daily educational panels, VIP parties, and a not-to-be-missed awards ceremony on the final day. Festival passes are on sale now at wildriversfilmfestival.com, and we can't wait to see you at the show. If you're just joining us, you're listening to Wild Rivers Film Radio. I'm Sue Wright, and I'm here with Ozzy. Today we're sitting down with Rabbi Robbie Schaefer, writer for the film Burst the Silence, one of our Wild Rivers Film Festival 2024 selections, and we recently screened the film again at our Afternoon Indie Series selection for June. Robbie, welcome to the Wild Rivers Film Radio.
Thank you so much, Sue, and thank you, Ozzy. I'm so happy to be with you.
Okay. Let's start by getting you to tell us just a little bit about yourself. You have several titles there.
Oh, title schmeidle. Yeah. Maybe the best thing to say about me is that I'm a restless sort, and maybe another way of putting that is adventurous. But I've been a musician and a songwriter most of my life, and most of my life I've made my living that way, performing and touring and recording and writing, and as I've told my own kids who at some points thought about getting into the arts as a profession, I would tell them not to have the goal to be a musician, but to have the goal to make a life in music.
That sounds like good advice.
It was good advice for myself anyway, yeah. So, it's just born out of my own experience, which is that, yeah, so I've toured and I've written and I've recorded and all of that stuff, but I've also... part of my life in music was starting a nonprofit some years ago to serve others through the arts, and part of it was working at Sirius XM radio for some years, and it's just taken on different forms. And then I ended up sort of nobody was more surprised than I was when I wrote a musical for the theater, and that is ultimately that musical turned into the screenplay for Burst the Silence. And so yeah, I just kind of go where this stuff leads me for the most part, and what excites me and lights me up, and here I am.
Okay, and that helps explain probably why Burst the Silence is a bit of a genre-breaking piece, right?
Yeah, probably. It still feels kind of theatrical, right?
Okay.
And it's at least I think it does, and I think it's. Yeah, obviously not just because it's a musical, but just even in the way that the film ended up getting made.
Okay, because DC Theater Scenes writes that the story, quote, unfolds a bit like a folk rock opera, a bit like a play, a bit like a musical, a bit like a concert, but mostly a poem, an epic one, with the father standing at the center, a hero who not only finds home but also shows his son the way. As a writer for Burst of Silence, can you tell us more about the story and working on the film project with director Eric Schaefer?
Sure. So the story itself is probably at this point the best way to describe it would be semi-autobiographical. My father was a Holocaust survivor. He passed away in 2015, and I had never considered writing a musical or anything like that. And it was maybe 6 months after that I found myself. I think we try to. It's human nature to reconcile our relationships once we start to have a little distance from them, and so I didn't realize when I started writing just some little essays down and some wayward songs that this is what I was doing, but eventually I was, and it was really just about understanding my relationship with my father better. He, even though he was a Holocaust survivor, he never called himself that. And I didn't realize he was a Holocaust survivor until I was in my 40s. It was just not something that was spoken about. And that's not an incredibly unusual dynamic in a family where a generation has survived enormous trauma like that. So, so this was my way of sort of reconciling all of this. And I started putting it down, and I after a few months, somebody introduced me to Eric Schaefer, who's we're not related.
You're not
Eric
related,
Schaefer
okay.
No, we are not. But he was at the time the artistic director at Signature Theater in Washington, D.C. And it turned out, was somebody who had heard, was actually a fan of the band that I'd toured with for a long time. And so we met, and one thing led to another, and he really helped guide me and guide this piece into a musical theater piece that had its premiere there in 2018. And then COVID hit. And so instead of going to another theater for a second production, Eric's idea was to turn it into a film.
Oh, interesting.
So that's how that happened. Yeah. If you remember when everything was shutting down for COVID, a lot of theaters were filming their productions in an empty theater.
Right.
Right. And then putting them up. Everybody was trying to make, keep the doors open. And I think that's why Eric had the idea. And then he realized that he actually owned some property, a bunch of acres out in West Virginia in the woods. And he said, why don't we, instead of shooting it inside the theater, why don't we shoot it in the woods?
Oh, great.
Outdoors. And so that's where that idea came from. And then as I was rewriting the script into a screenplay, which is also something I'd never done before, it just sort of took on a life of its own and became the film that we made.
It's because one of the things I was going to ask about were your choices for the elements that make the film unique, the actors, the music, but also the film location and the camera angles.
Well, I'd love to hear more about the camera angle part. That's not my expertise,
okay.
And it's not. I wasn't the one making those decisions, but
so we probably have to talk with the other Schaefer then.
Well, either with Eric as the director, or Jimmy Ray, who is the director of photography, the cinematographer. As far as the location, the woods, basically, when I wrote this story for the theater, there is ultimately a scene in it, sort of in the 11th hour of the story, where my father and the family are hiding.
Mm-hmm.
In an attic. And that is actually how it happened in real life. And then when we talked about transferring this into the woods and shooting the entire thing in the woods, mostly for COVID reasons, right?
Right.
Doing it outdoors would make sense. What I did with the script is I realized, first of all, there's a long history of there were so many families during the Second World War who did hide in the woods for years.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, what if they were hiding in the woods instead of in an attic? And basically the reason the whole thing is shot in the woods is because emotionally, Connie, my father, he was, a young child then. Emotionally, he's been stuck in that woods ever since.
His whole life.
And Yes. And so the only way for me, his son, to actually find him, emotionally speaking, would be to find him in that woods. Um, and so it actually ended up being a very central part to the film, and really gave it so much. We almost talked a lot about the woods actually being a character unto itself.
It does seem like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, the use of the woods. It's nice to hear the way that you think of the way you put your art together, because you can watch someone's film and you get the impression you get from somebody's art, but getting to hear the way you described how you came up with it it's a real treat. It's real inspiring to hear that some of the elements of this you'd never done before. You'd never done a screenplay before.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for saying that. Yeah, it was a very difficult thing to do, and I probably naively, I think I said, when Eric said, "Why don't you just take the script and this, shift it, make a screenplay out of it?" And I thought, well, how hard could that be?
But it's not, actually it is, isn't it?
Turns out real hard, real hard.
I'm just going to interject here that one of the things that the Wild Rivers Film Festival does is host a 2-week film workshop for local teens. And we raise the money to bring filmmakers from professional filmmakers from around the country here to provide them with, in this workshop, a week of instruction, and then a week of support is they're filming their own pilot for a teen comedy news program. And so we started with script writing and how that works.
Yeah, it's tough, right? It's tough. I think it's tough. What was hard for me was that unlike, say, writing songs and making an album, which is something that I'm used to doing for much of my life, there's a much broader palette in film, right? There's so many ways to tell the story that don't involve words, right? And so I just found myself saying too much in the script constantly, and cutting lines and cutting lines and cutting lines, because all of these things could be said through camera movement or simply through much more subtle facial expressions
yeah.
and things like this that you don't need text for, And I think that was probably, if I can answer a little bit to your question about camera angles, is that I do know this, and I don't know if this is maybe what either of you got from it. I'd be interested if you got something else. But I know Eric talked a lot about wanting it to be essentially a film that felt intimate, and that was focused on these relationships. I think a lot of the camera angles and the camera positioning were set up to really focus on that. Yes, we get the woods, but there are very few big grand shots in there, and rarely are there more than 2 people in a scene. Right. Occasionally there are, but that was intentional on Eric's part. He really wanted to focus on these very one-on-one relationships.
I think of it as your muse when you're in the the prairie, in the grass, the 2 chairs and the table. It looks kind of like theater, but it is very intimate. But then there's scenes in the woods where it's fairly chaotic and the angles are off, and you just feel really tense when Connie is remembering his childhood.
Yeah, I found it to be really great, the interaction between just the 2 characters, because when you think back about moments in your life, it's when you started a relationship, or that significant thing that really sticks in your memory. You don't remember all of the details of the years, but there's those big moments in your life that when you first meet someone, or something else dramatic happens. I really like the way you guys did that.
Thank you. Thanks for saying that.
I'm more on usually the words angle than I am. I'm less versed in the camera angles and stuff, so I really picked up on the interactions between the people.
That's good. Yeah, you and I are alike then. We like the words.
Also, I'm just curious. as a man, you have a relationship with father. As a father, you have a relationship with the son.
Oh, yeah. The back in the day, well, even still to this day, me and the friends, we would call this the family story. Whether it's your relationship with your mom or your dad, or your children.
Mm-hmm.
And it's intrinsically such a huge part of our reality. And there's so many different ways to tell the story. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you discovered more about your father having survived the Holocaust when you were in your 40s? Because
Sure.
the family dynamic between father and son is already a difficult thing or an intense thing, but then you add that on top of it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an insightful question. Yeah, I think, I always knew my father had been alive during the war, and there were allusions to that, but it was just clear it was not something you ever really asked about. And I think we as children sense things, right? We sense when there are things being kept silent in a family. We may not know what that's about. We don't even know what questions to ask. I just think children absorb so much more than we often give them credit for. And I think that was true of me. I didn't even realize that I absorbed that there were these silences in our family until much later. And then I understood, oh, that's what I was feeling when I was 6 or 10 or whatever. And I think my father, to his, there's no right way to move forward in a family with that kind of trauma, right? And I think he, like so many Holocaust survivors, wanted to protect us from it. They didn't want that to be part of our lives and part of our consciousness. He had eventually landed here in the United States and very much loved America and wanted a fresh start here, which is what he did. And he wanted us to be part of that fresh start, not of that old story. And the answer, I think, is that these things get passed down to us, whether they're spoken or not. There's no avoiding them.
They get passed on through generations too. Not
They sure
just
do.
Holocaust survivors. Both of my parents were survivors of childhood trauma, not at that level, but they didn't talk about it. But we knew there were things that were off, and we just didn't talk. We didn't fight, but we didn't talk. And I was in my 30s before either of, and then older with my mother before either of them talked about the trauma in their childhood. And you had to sort of pull it out of them at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. See, I think it is. I think it's human nature. And you're right that, this goes beyond the Holocaust, right? There are plenty of studies done on families who have ancestors who were slaves.
Right.
Or Native American communities, right? That there are these traumas that get passed on 2, 3, 4, 5 generations on, and it's quite something. And then, as for my story, Ozzy, you had asked about how did I start to learn? It really was more. My father, as is depicted in the film, was sick later in life. He ended up dying from dementia, from Alzheimer's. And as so often happens when people develop dementia, the short-term memory is long-term, very significant moments that are embedded deep within you. They come to the surface. And so some of that started to happen. And then my father has an older sister, Rivka, who's also depicted in the film, and she's actually still alive. She's now 91 years old, and living in Tel Aviv. And so she actually, once I started asking questions, filled me in on more and more details. So I found out more, but that's mostly how I started to flesh out the story a little bit.
And then to put that on paper in a theatrical production, it's just a really vulnerable thing, I would imagine, to begin to tell the story in what's going to become a very public way.
You'd think I would have thought of that ahead of time. But Also, I guess if I had, maybe I never would have made it. I never would have done it. But you're absolutely right. I had the experience with
Hmm.
both the theater, the staged musical,
Uh-huh.
and then again with the film. I had moments, maybe weeks before each of those things were going to premiere, and yeah, had a thought like, oh God, what have I done? What if this realization that I'm actually gonna lots of people are gonna actually hear this, and yeah, I think if we thought that way, way ahead of time, probably would never start making anything that's vulnerable. So
Um,
it's
Sure.
probably a blessing.
Yeah.
as I can identify as a new filmmaker because our first film with the Wild Rivers Coast Foundation for Dance was created during COVID when our
Oh,
students couldn't do their Nutcracker performance. So it's like, okay, we're going to write a screenplay and we're going to we're going to make a movie about the
yeah,
Nutcracker. And if we'd known what we were doing when we started, we wouldn't have done it. We would have just said it's impossible to take 40 plus kids and make a movie during COVID. But we did
yeah,
it, and it's a
absolutely.
beautiful film with a wonderful message. So thank you for just going for it.
Yeah, no, I'm glad I did as well.
I think your film is very aptly named, and it's a tale that so many people can identify with, and then look at their own family and wonder what else is the story that I haven't been told yet. Like 'cause usually it's not until later in life that the parents or grandparents or whoever starts to tell you some of the other sides of the story that's been left out your whole life.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that, Ozzy. Because Eric and I both worked very hard on this in what is obviously a very particular story about a Holocaust survivor and his son. It's a story. It's a Jewish story, right? In that way,
Hmm.
and yet we didn't want to make a Jewish movie in quotes. We wanted to make a movie and a story that yes, you can enter into it simply as a Jewish movie. It's also a father-son story, or even extrapolated more, just a parent-child story. It's also a story about dementia, and it's a story about what are the things that we forget, and what do we remember, what do we bring forward throughout generations, and who's responsible for bringing those things forward. Those are a lot of the questions we had, I think, and you never know how it's going to reach people, right? And I'm gratified that you brought that up because I think it does reach people on different levels. I had somebody came up to me after one of the theater performances back in 2018 in tears and trying to get the words out, and just said, I just want to let you know, the story resonated with me so much because it's like in my own life, I also had a dog that died. And that was the part of the whole thing, the dog dying, was that was really emotional and resonant for this person. And I thought, well, great.
Okay, well, we're coming down to the end of our podcast, and it's gone really quickly for me. Just have a couple of other questions. I understand that you're touring on the West Coast, Robbie, and that you're speaking to
Yes.
us from Portland. Can you just tell our listeners where home is for you? Do you like Portland? And have you ever visited the Southern Oregon coast?
Hmm. So I live in Alexandria, Virginia, which is right across the river from Washington, D.C. And this is not my first trip to Oregon, nor is it my first trip to Portland, although I haven't been to Portland for probably about 15 or 20 years. It's been a little while. And as far as the Southern Oregon coast, I actually, I've never been to the Southern Oregon coast. I do have family through my wife's family who live in Medford and Klamath Falls and these parts of Oregon, but I haven't actually been to the coast.
One of
Would
these
love to.
days you're going to have to get here. It's amazing.
Yeah, I would love that.
Oh, you're fully invited. Please come visit.
Thank you. I would love to. In fact, I think I remember when it actually screened the first time in 2024, and I I seem to remember I was somewhere else in the world, and had thought, boy, I would love to get to the Oregon coast for that, and come in person, and it just, the travel schedule wouldn't allow it. But
Well, we have a pretty big
another
music
time.
community here, too.
Oh, good. That's good to know.
I got one more quick thing to say. The father-son relationship, it definitely spoke to me from, both directions. My father and my being a father. So I would have said a little more about how it affected me, but I didn't want to make the interview at all about myself because we're interviewing you, But it definitely hit. It was something that would bring up feeling. It brings up those feelings of your relationships with people, and for better or worse, if you have the kind of relationship, you haven't dealt with some of the emotional baggage or the stuff from the past, it would have moved me in a different way than if I hadn't done some of the work to clear up some of my feelings of my own father-son relationships.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for saying that.
You're welcome, man. It was powerful.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you both for, and your whole community for supporting this film. It really means a lot to me.
Okay, well, Robbie, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much.
And to our listeners, if you're just joining us, you're listening to the Wild Rivers Film Radio. I'm Sue Wright, and I'm here with Ozzy Pops.
Thank you, Sue.
Ozzy's reviewing Bolan, a short documentary by Vincent DeFrancesco of the Siskiyou Mountain Club, which will be screening at the Wild Rivers Film Festival later this August. And that's it for this episode of the Wild Rivers Film Radio. If you want to learn more about the festival, buy passes, volunteer for us, or sign up for a sponsorship, you can learn more and get connected at wildriversfilmfestival.com. You can also find the festival on Facebook and Instagram. Recording here was done by Michael Gorse. Sound mixing and editing is done by Tom Bozak. Our producer is Amanda Whittemore, and today's guest was Robbie Schaefer. I'm Sue Wright with Ozzy Pops. Until next time.
We'll see you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.